And I'm very pleased to be welcoming Elena Cavagnaro, Professor of Sustainability in Hospitality and Tourism at NHL Stenden University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands. Elena has consulted for several organizations in sectors such as hospitality, retail, and healthcare on sustainability, strategy, and implementation. Following her understanding of sustainability as a multi-dimensional and multi-layered concept, her research focuses on issues that run across and connect the social, the organizational, and the individual. The book, 3 Levels of Sustainability, which she co-authored with Curiel, is a bestseller and is under review for its 2nd edition. And her edited book, Sustainable Value Creation in Hospitality, Guests on Earth, was published in April 2018. So we're very pleased that Elena has taken up a position as visiting professor in sustainability in hospitality and tourism here at the University of Sunderland, where our hospitality provision was recently ranked in the 100 to 150 in the world, according to the QS World University Rankings released just this year. So we're very excited and pleased to welcome Elena to deliver her inaugural professorial lecture entitled Human Nature, Time and Tourism.
Thank you for this introduction, Professor Young, and also thank to the All University of Sunderland for the honor that they bestowed on me when they asked me to become a visiting professor at your institution. I would also like to thank Professor Chambers for her kindness in guiding me through the process of joining you today. And with this said, I would like to share my screen with you, meaning that I'm going to lose you actually, to not be able to see you. And I hope you can see the PowerPoint presentation that I've prepared for you today with these 3 concepts central to it: human nature, time, and tourism. If you see myself looking at the, a little bit on the left, is because I have there a screen with all my notes. As probably you understand, I'm not British, I'm Italian, so I do apologize if I'm going to misspell all the scholars' name in this presentation. I would like to start with a little bit of history, actually, how I came to this, to connect these 3 themes. So let me say this, so my first point of this conversation with you together is about my positionality. Where do I come from? And I come from studies in philosophy, where for my PhD, I addressed the concept of time in the book Physics of Aristotle, so ancient philosophy. But I left this line of study when I entered the University of Applied Sciences at NHL Stenden as a lecturer in business ethics. And, as a philosopher, I was quite confident of my understanding of the basics of ethics and its application to the business operation. So, teaching business ethics in a context of a University of Applied Sciences to students who were formed to become manager and business people proved more difficult than I anticipated. You can imagine how they stared at me when I was discussing utilitarianism of the categorical imperative of Kant. And I'm speaking now 1997, 1998, I was looking into other venues to convey to my students the notion that value is more than price, and that also business people should try to do good and avoid harm. And 1997, 1998 was the time that the concept of corporate social responsibility were coming from UK actually to the continent, to the Netherlands, and I grasped on it. And as your Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Young, was saying, together with my colleague, George Curiel, we try to make sense of it, and particularly how the concept of corporate social responsibility connects to the concept of sustainable development. And that is where this book is coming from with this title, The 3 Levels of Sustainability. As Professor Young was saying, we indeed understand sustainability as a process of value creation that should be played, so to say, at 3 different levels, and a process that involves 3 dimensions at each level. And if you have if you are involved in sustainability studies, you may recognize the author level as the level of society, when these three elements of creation, value creation on economic, social, and environmental dimension, coming to us from the Brundtland definition, from the work of the Earth Summit in 1997. You will probably also recognize the middle triangle of these three concentric triangles that actually shows the understanding of John Elkington of sustainability as triple bottom line, but you may be unfamiliar with the middle triangle. And this is what George and me consider our contribution to the debate on sustainability, and it concerns the individual level. And as you see, we were describing this individual level as having also three characteristics, of which one is self-directed, care for me, and two are other-directed, care for me, you to people, to humans, and care for all to non-humans or to future humans. So sustainability as a value creation on 3 levels and 9 dimensions. Second big interest of mine alongside time is sustainability, but particularly the role of humans, of people in there, and this vision of human nature as capable to go beyond care for me. And then you might ask, where does tourism come into the equation? Now, we are now speaking 2004. The University of Applied Sciences got the opportunity to do research, not only teaching, we were teaching universities. And I got appointed in 2004 as Professor of Sustainability in Hospitality and Tourism, actually a little bit later, the name changed. But there I started, I was already working in the realm of services, but then I started to concentrate myself more and more in tourist studies. And also they are trying to look into sustainability issues from the perspective of the person making choices, tourist choices. So you see these three elements, tourism, human nature, time, have been a long part of my scholarly work. But I was a little bit unaware of the possibility to connect them. And particularly time, to bring time back into the equation. And so I have to say I'm really grateful to a webinar I was listening to in January that was organized by Professor David Fennell, that you probably know as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Ecotourism, and that actually has as a title, Tourism and Altruism. And there I was kind of opened to this possibility to reintroduce time in the discourse of human nature and tourism, as we will see in a moment, when I'm going to start the second main part of my discourse with you, my talking with you. Before I go there, though, just a little note. As you understand, I am starting to connect time, human nature, and tourism in the way I'm going to talk to you today. So I would like to kind of warn that probably at the end of this conversation, there will be more question mark opens than answers. And that's why I really welcome a discussion afterwards. And so what I would like to do next is just very briefly look at COVID as the big reset. Maybe you are, as many of us, a little bit sick of speaking about COVID in tourism. Unfortunately, it is still the situation we find ourselves, and I think it's important to look at it. And from there, I will transition to the necessity to look at our paradigms on human nature, particularly when it comes to the tourist and the person behind the tourist, and how looking at those paradigms makes sense also when we speak sustainability or try to enhance sustainability in tourism and hospitality. From there, the role of time and tourism, time and altruism will be touched, and then I will conclude bringing all this together and try to summarize where I stand and opening the discussion on everything I said, including the question marks that I still have. So let's start with this COVID at the big reset. So in the debate about post-COVID recovery, so many people in the tourist community voiced the hope that tourists would recover after COVID in a more gentle way, a way more attentive to people, to the community, hosting the tourists, a way more respectful to the local culture, more sustainable, more protective, and even restorative of the natural environment. But I guess that we have, and what I guess, sorry, we were thinking about when we were looking at COVID in that way, is that we were looking at COVID-19 as a big disruptor, as a big crisis. And maybe some of us went back with our thoughts to this idea that was presented by Milton Friedman in the 1960s and then voiced again in the 1980s. And it is, I quote, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produce real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. So the idea is indeed that crises are a moment of change, and that people during crisis grasp on ideas that are there, and that can at that moment be actuated when, while before it was seen, they were seen as kind of impossible. And when we were in COVID-19, and I'm not I think the only one, I was thinking, okay, the idea of sustainable tourism is an idea that has been lying around for a long, long time. We can go back to the 1970s and look at the first, even earlier, for this debate about tourism and ethics, tourism and sustainability, tourism and conservation, etc. So I was kind of confident that after COVID, we would grasp on that idea that was lying around. But actually, it didn't happen, isn't it? Tourism after COVID seems to have been gone back to the pre-COVID type of tourism. For example, if I look at a recent publication of the Center of Expertise in Leisure Tourism and Hospitality that has been developed for the European Tourist Commission, what I read in there is that travelers have no intentions to change their travel behavior after COVID. Maybe they will stay a little bit longer. Maybe they will not travel so far away to such exotic destination. The report was published in February 2022, but they will go. They will not change their behavior. And even in terms of long-haul destination, if we look at the most recent data from TUI, the travel organization, they point into people actually flying further, of going further away for a vacation and stay a little bit longer. So it seems that tourism has started back on the same premises of, far away, long vacation, more vacations than we were into pre-COVID. So is this, when I consider Milton Friedman's point, our hope as a scholarly community that COVID could be, the big change, game changer in tourist behavior, I ask myself, haven't we as scholars being able to put this idea, to make this idea of sustainable tourism available enough? Now that seems strange because, as I was saying, the sustainable tourism is debated and we know a lot about how to implement it, and we have also best practices about it since, decennia. And then I caught myself in this thought, maybe what we have failed to address is a more profound idea that is lying around. And it is an idea not about, tourism as a business, or tourism operations, or tourist destination, but it's an idea about the tourist. And, going back to the tourist and looking at their role in tourism I'm not the first one, to claim that should be done. I would like to share with you this, in my opinion, beautiful statement by Professor Prexkalski, and I will quote it for you. Tourism is first of all a form of man's behavior. Man is the essential subject of tourism. Tourism cannot be explained unless you understand man, the human being. Tourism is at present a form of man's life, a way to materialize various value. So there is a call here to not only to also problematize or to look in which are tourist values, because as Professor Prozalski says to us, tourism is a form of behavior that make those values visible. And the point I'm trying to make in now is that I think that we have indeed to go into this exploration together as quickly as possible about how we may perceive human values. And to do so, I would like to borrow an experiment from a thought experiment from a colleague, Professor Tom Postmes from the University of Groningen. And I would like you to follow me and to try to make a decision about a choice I'm going to share with you in a moment. This thought experiment involves a crisis situation, a situation I hope you will never be into or have never been into. It's an emergency landing, and all crew and passengers survived the emergency landing, but then something happened next, and there are in this thought experiment two possibilities from which you could choose. The first possibility is called by Professor Postmet Planet A. In this situation, people panic. There is screaming, and passengers, fight to reach the exit as soon as possible. And in the process, people that got injured or who cannot move so quickly are left behind. In Planet B, the same situation and a different reaction. The people who survive, all of them actually keep relatively calm, and they help each other to reach the exit in a rather ordered way, and people who feel strong enough even go back to check if everybody went out of the plane. Now, if I ask you in a split second to make a decision, what do you think is, which of these two planets is the one we are living now? Now, if my audience today resembles my audience in the past, and also the students and audience of Professor Postmes, then probably you will choose for Planet A. Actually, in my experience, above 90% of the people confronted with the choice choose for Planet A. And then if I am in an academic class and I ask people to explain why they think we are in Planet A, usually they refer to, maybe without quoting, to Cannon's view of this fight, flight, and freeze response as an instinctive way we cope with crisis. Is instinctive in the sense that has been hardwired in our blood and sinews and in our brains through, as Professor Cannon says, innumerable injuries that we have been exposed to in the course of our evolution. And that's why it's kind of an escapable response. So if we are confronted with crisis, we tend to try to save ourselves either by fighting, flighting, freezing, and then later on other F were added, including fainting. And if I read Professor Cannon's work and the work that is based on his, I, as a philosopher, am strongly reminded by Hobbes' view on humans being as a kind of as matter in motion, that are instinctively drawn towards pleasure and repelled by pain, so they try to avoid pain and seeking pleasure because those are conductive of their personal survival. So it's an idea of people, human beings focused on their own survival, on their self, on their own pleasure in pain. And this view that I would kind of call a dismal view on human nature is very popular. I mean, this can be found in science fiction, in literature, is held by a lot of people. 90% of the people are confronted with this emergency landing dilemma, choose for Planet A. Politicians, they abide to this view, but also us, also us as student scholars seems to voice this view. And in the next slide, you see alongside the quote of Professor Brzezinski that I showed you earlier, also a quote by Professor Wheeler, and I would like to ask you to look at it. Professor Wheeler was saying, tourism, and I quote, is a world driven largely by avarice, by greed, by self-interest. We need, therefore, to look first at ourselves and then at society when we address tourism. The second part of the quote I could not be more in agreement with. Also in the 3 levels of sustainability framework that I have shown you before, George and I would like to convey, through that framework, would like to convey the notion that sustainability starts and ends with the individual human being, and that indeed we have to look into the values that drive us if we wish to properly develop sustainability at the level of organization and society. And yet I'm a little bit more doubtful about the first part of this quote by Professor Wheeler, that tourism, such as other business activities of other human activities, is a world driven largely by avarice, greed, and self-interest. But let's for a moment imagine that this is, the human being, that the human being is this self-interested person seeking for personal pleasure, avoiding pain for himself, a person where the component that are more directed to the other or even to the wider world as kind of sucked up, if I can say it in that way, to strengthen the individual fitness for survival. Meaning in this case that I will relate to others, but only if I can benefit from that. That I may protect the environment, but only if I directly benefit from that. And if we look at this view on human beings, and then we ask ourselves, okay, would this connect to sustainability? I doubt it, because sustainability, as I was also briefly saying at the beginning, as we have received it from works such as the Brundtland Report of the World Commission of Environment and Development, such as their summit teaches us, or as in its application as the triple bottom line, what sustainability is asking is a more balanced form of development where at least equal attention is given at all 3 components of it. The more economic profit-related component, and also the social, planet-related, the environmental or planet-related dimension. And a human being that is skewed towards care for me, in my opinion, will not be able to fit in the picture, or be the core, the starting point, the sparkling fire of this picture. I think they would more fit in this type of picture where society and organization are much more directed towards profit maximization of economic value maximization. Sometimes someone would say, yeah, that's exactly the situation we are in it. And as Professor Wheeler say, our world driven by greed, driven by selfishness, not sustainable. So if this is the case, we sustainability scholars have a very short story to tell, because if the human being is mainly motivated by greed and selfishness, it seems quite impossible to get a more balanced development where also future generation, also non-humans, are taken into account. And yet I would like to say the story is not complete. So if we go back to the experiment I was bringing you through about the two reactions on an emergency landing, scholarly work on crisis actually shows that the response that people have at disaster is consistently aligned not with planet A, but with planet B. Meaning that, for example, Heslot and Rautenberg in the 2004 studies on how people reacted after, I think it was after Katrina, they concluded that citizens do not panic, and actually that their response shows a high level of pro-social behavior. And they even said, and I have now to look for the quote here, that citizens prove to be the most effective kind of emergency personnel. So they also saw, people plundering, and they were also saying, okay, very few of these people plundering were doing for their own sake, but most people plundering after the crisis that they observed, they would do so to have, food and drinks to share with people, and so they make a very strong case, and they're not the only one, that in time of crisis we do react pro-socially. And I guess that if we think back at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we could see that pro-social behavior in action. And my claim is that we are on planet B because human nature is much more complex than this, pleasure-seeking, pain-avoiding, self-utility maximizing machine that the man is in the account of some scholar, and even, again, in the public perception, political perception, etc. This is where the scholarly discourse on pro-social behavior and altruism enters the scene. Yet, of course, the moment we call in altruism, a couple of questions bunch back to us. Some of those are, what is altruism? How we should define it? How it developed? Which function it serves? What enhances an altruistic behavior? What inhibits it? And so forth and so on. And altruism has been of interest to several disciplines, and meaning also that the answers to this question are very diverse. And I don't pretend to know them all, and I think that nobody can. Because our starting point has been, evolution theory with Cannon, I choose to stay on that line and to go for you in studies grounded on evolution theory. I do so because of the time limit of this lecture today, but also because it is on this type of study that also Professor Fenner grounded his idea of reciprocal altruism in tourism. And you may remember me saying at the beginning that it's thanks to Professor Fenner that I got into this thinking. And so I guess that it makes sense to stay in this line of scholarly work. So that's why in this slide you see presented to you the theory of altruism and reciprocal altruism, as it was developed by Professor Trivers in 1971. This is the first, Trivers was the first to introduce the concept of reciprocal altruism, and also in his theory, Professor Fenner bases his discussion. Social biology is, you may say, a branch of, is grounded on evolution theory, and that's why the basis statement is the basis statement of evolution theory, meaning that the environment where people find themselves, where people and animals found themselves in, put pressure on them, and natural selection favors then the survival of the fittest in this environment. And then Professor Trivers, on this basis, proposes that reciprocal altruism is supportive of survival because, and then I quote, in the long run, reciprocal altruism acts, they benefit the organism performing them. So the idea is that if I do something nice for you, later on you will do something nice for me, and we will be both better off. The Professor Trivers himself points to the fact that the time lag in this process of reciprocity is the crucial factor. In the sense that reciprocal altruism can only develop under specific conditions. And among these conditions, there are more, I would like to bring to your attention two. One is that people should have, as Professor Trivers called it, a suitably long lifespan, because this favors repeated encounter. If the life is nasty and short, reciprocal altruism cannot develop because there is little chance that we will meet each other again. And so if I do something nice to you, that you could reciprocate. But also another necessity for Professor Trivers is that there should be low dispersal rate. So communities should be tight and people should stay together. And because this, of course, make repeated interaction among the same individuals more eventful, but easier. And so if one of these conditions does not exist or ceases to exist, the conclusion is that reciprocal altruism will not work in a context of natural selection, and then it will make much more sense, will be much more rational to cheat, meaning not to reciprocate. So you do something nice to me, but probably I will never encounter you again. So I will not reciprocate, and that makes me doing something nice for you, probably at the beginning of our interaction, and not the most slim action in this context. And this is also the trouble when we apply reciprocal altruism as an altruist theory to tourism, exactly because this concept of time. Because reciprocal altruism needs this repeated encounter in time, and modern tourism actually doesn't permit those. I just quote here a data for you, probably you're familiar with it, and it is about global trends in length of stay. And this length of stay, as felt, constantly in the 20 years that Professor Gersling, Professor Scott, and Professor Hall were investigated, coming to 4.6 nights in 2015, meaning that people are staying short on the same location and making the opportunity to encounter the same people at that location minimal. I was also looking into data about people coming to the same place. I have to say that it's not easy to find this data. So if you have any idea how we can grasp on this data, you're more than welcome to share it with me. The data that I could find were only at national or regional level, and that of course doesn't say enough. I needed, at the level of places. But I guess that also the highlighted interest on returning intentions and what are the antecedents of returning intentions in the scholarly literature on tourism may signal that people don't come back to the same place as often as they, for example, did when I was a child. So meaning that there are no conditions for reciprocal altruism to form. That is the conclusion of Professor Fana also in the webinar I am quoting constantly in my talk. And so cheating actually is the best option. That is, again, a very dismal view on tourists, isn't it, and on tourism, and making the encounter between the tourist and the host community a kind of, can I say, not sustainable, not gentle in any case, or at least the premise for such an encounter. Before critically analyze this conclusion from using time as a concept and then opening up to other views on altruism, I would like to make a brief recap of where we are now. So what I have argued till now is that one of the reasons why COVID-19 has not brought a sustainable, ethical, or local turn in tourism is because we have failed to address ideas lying around, and particularly our idea on human nature. That we should address human nature in tourism is because tourism is an expression of human values. And if we keep thinking of human as self-serving, selfish, as looking only for pleasure for themselves, we will probably not be able to construct a sustainable form of tourism. And even if we open up to some concept of altruism, such as reciprocal altruism, we're not helped enough because, as we have seen, reciprocal altruism falls short in its application to tourism because tourism encounters qualify as too short and one shot, so they don't meet the conditions for reciprocal altruism to develop. As I said, I have some question marks about this conclusion. I would like to share it with you. And one question mark is about the way time is understood in reciprocal altruism, and the other one is about the way altruism can be looked at. You see, time in reciprocal altruism, at least in the discussion as far as I could understand it, is mainly seen as the physical time of encounter between the host and the guest. The length of stay, type of time that Professor Gersling and his co-author were speaking about in my previous slide. But time can also be understood differently. And then I would like to bring you back quickly to ancient Greece. A philosopher in ancient Greece, they were fascinated by the concept of time. Time was a god, Kronos, with a lot of powers, but they were particularly fascinated by this unsteadiness of time. That is, that in the painting that you see on your right by Dutch painter wonder is symbolized by the wings. So this unsteadiness of time, the idea that time flies, what I hope is also going to doing for you during this lecture. And one group of Greek philosophers who were trying to grasp this unsteadiness of time was the sophists, very keen people traveling from city to city and speaking to the public. And they had for their public a kind of riddle. And the riddle was to the message of the riddle was that time doesn't exist because, you know, the past is no more, the future is not yet, and the now is this kind of liminal time between something that is no more and something that is not yet. So also this liminal time has no existence. And this riddle made, you know, other philosophers crazy, and it was amply discussed in Greek philosophy. But I'm not going to annoy you with all this discussion. I will jump to one of the solutions to this riddle that was given actually by one of the first Christian philosopher, Augustine. And Augustine was pointing at time not only as something physical, but also as something that is connected with our soul. He was calling it an extension anime. So it's a kind of our soul stretching back to the past with memories and stretching out into the future with desires, expectations, and so on. And you see, I think that if we grasp time not only as a physical condition where host and guest, where tourists in the community meet, but at this extension anime, we have a chance in our time to maybe organize reciprocal altruism. Because this time extension, time of the consciousness, time of our soul, Augustine and other with him, after him, such as Henri Bergson, are speaking about, materializes in our society, for example, in social media and review sites. And maybe we could think more profoundly how we can, you know, how we can frame, how we can design those social media and review sites in a way that the conversation between host and guest, between tourists and the hosting community is enhanced so that reciprocal altruism can blossom. And when I was trying to start thinking about the practical implication of this idea, I came directly across a problem, and that is that in some of those sites, you know, the power seems to be more in the hand of the tourist and the guest than in the hand of the host. And so I guess that if we are taking on this idea that should be also from a theoretical perspective analyzed better and try to make it practical, we should in any case take care that this possible imbalance between the tourist and the host and the guest, the tourist and the local community on this materialization of extended time on social sites, social media and review sites, that this balance is addressed. This being said, I would like to leave the time for a moment as a concept and bring you back into altruism. So so what I've said till now is we could maybe open up reciprocal altruism. We could maybe solve the problem of the trouble of reciprocal altruism applied to tourism by, you know, giving another interpretation of time. But I would like also to share with you that reciprocal altruism is not the only way we can understand altruism, and that I'm happy that is in this way, because if we think it through, reciprocal altruism is a form of altruism, but actually the other is out of the question. So I hope you can still follow me. Let's go back for a moment to a quote of Professor Travis I was already showing to you. And it is this idea that reciprocal altruist acts are supportive of survival because in the long run, they benefit the organism performing them. You see, this is not altruism. This is kind of a postponed selfishness. You are probably familiar with the idea of postponed consumption, of postponed gratification. Now I propose a new term, postponed selfishness. So I'm not selfish now, but I am, if we are in this community of people meeting each other more and more often, I'm quite sure that I can get this back. So it's a kind of postponed selfishness, isn't it? So it's not about the other, it's about me. And indeed, Professor Travis says this with so many words. He says in his articles, and I quote, models that attempt to explain altruistic behavior in terms of natural selection are models designed to take the altruism out of the altruism. You see, we're still in this dismal view of human being as selfish, and the only form of altruism they can perform is a selfish form of altruism. Unfortunately enough, we are also other perspective. And again, just to keep this limited and to leave also some time for discussion, I would like to show to you this, that is another way to looking at altruism, also from evolution theory. This is work from Professor De Waal, and trying to keep it short, I would like just not read the text, just focus on the picture on the left. This is a chimpanzee helping a child out of the tree. And Professor De Waal observed several of this type of behavior, also between chimpanzees that were not related, such, for example, young female helping an old female to water. And he concluded that this is a non-reciprocal form of altruism. Because, you know, for example, the young females chimpanzees helping the old chimpanzee, what kind of reciprocation they could expect? So he was proposing empathy as a non-reciprocal basis of altruism. And empathy is me seeing the other in distress, feeling that distress, understanding the distress, and acting to relieve that distress. So you see, there are other possibility to understand altruism in primates, and as Professor De Waal contends, also in human. There are leaving evolution theory, other theoretical perspective on brought us non-reciprocal altruism, such as this one is coming from psychology, such as psychology. Again, due to time, I'm not going to dive too much in this, but you see here 3 values intended as guiding principle in life, and those, and you see there the egoistic one, the selfish individual, but also the altruistic is all about helping others and bonding with others, and then biospheric value, that is kind of altruist square, is protecting the environment and also enjoying the beauty of the environment. And why I'm showing this picture is because it has been fundamental in the creation of the idea of human being that can go beyond the self, that can transcend this element of care for me and go for care for me and you and care for all, go for a non-reciprocal form of altruism. And that has been central indeed to our idea of the 3 levels of sustainability, because with this triple capability, people may be able to think and act on, you know, a triple bottom line at the level of organization, or a triple value creation at the level of society. So this brings me to the concluding summary. What I argue today is, in the context of this starting to understand the relationship between human nature, time, and tourism, is that time is a multidimensional concept. We can look at this as the time of the physical encounter, but also as the time of the consciousness, opening up the opportunity to extend the encounter between tourists and the community, the host and the guest, and make reciprocal altruism possible. But I've also argued that altruism is a multidimensional concept. That is not only that we are not only left with reciprocal altruism with all its implications, but altruism is also not reciprocal. For example, empathy-based altruism, and that if we bring into the shore those forms of altruism, that we may be in a better position to create tourism experiences where altruism is part of the equation. You see in this slide, there are, to me, still a lot of questions I have to think about, both theoretically and in practice. But one of the things I really would like to insist upon, notwithstanding how my thinking is going to develop in the next years, also with you, my colleagues at the University of Sunderland, is that I think that as scholars, also in the tourist field, we should really raise our voice to show that a dismal view of humans as a selfish individual is not the only possible one. So, colleagues, I come to the end of my inaugural lecture concluding with a big question mark. As you have seen, I'm entering this I'm not really entering the field of inquiry of sustainability or sustainability in tourism, but the connection between time, human nature, and tourism is new to me. So I'm really curious about your questions, suggestions, encouragements, maybe, hopefully. And so I would like to stop talking and maybe even sharing my presentation so that I can see you again and start this conversation, in the hope that I was clear enough and my Italian accent does not make impossible listening to me. So Donna, back to you, I guess.
Thank you so much for that really interesting presentation. I think that as tourism academics, we don't sort of delve, well, maybe I'm speaking for myself here, we perhaps don't delve as much into these kind of philosophical questions. And I think these are really important if we're looking at sort of human beings as really central to the tourism encounter. So I'm going to encourage people to type any questions or comments they have in the chat, because I'm not going to take any questions live. So if you have a question or comment, please put it in the chat. I do see that there's a question already from Lawrence, but before I sort of ask that one, can I just go back to this notion of time that you mentioned? And I know that in different social groupings, in different human, the way that humans are organized, the notion of time is different. So we kind of have this Western notion of time as opposed to non-Western notions of time. And I just wondered how that comes into this discussion of human nature and time, you know, this notion of time. Are we perhaps too fixated on a sort of Western notion of time? And if we think about time differently or otherwise, might that help us in terms of our, you know, our understanding of this issue? Sorry, this is just something I'm putting out there. You may or may not be able to answer, but I thought that that was really, you know, something interesting. Yeah.
Professor Chambers, thank you for this question. That's amazing, actually. And thank you also for pointing me to that, because I have not yet brought it into the conversation. Yes, indeed, looking back to the Greek philosophers I was quoting, of Augustine, of Bergson, they are in this Western tradition of time seen as linear, coming from the past, going into the future. Even though there is also in Greek philosophy the idea of time as circular, and that is more, we know, when looking at the stars and the seasons and the way they come back. And actually, my colleague Lucia Tomasini and I were trying to think about these themes also in the context of the circular economy. We're going back to that conception of time as maybe be one of the foundational of the idea of circularity also in the economy. So yes, I'm aware of this, at least these two traditions, probably there are even more. And I thank you very, very much for your suggestion to go into that in what I hope is going to be a paper on the concept of time, altruism, and tourism, but then focus on time. So I will take note of this. Amazing, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a couple of questions as well from our audience, and the first one comes from Lawrence. Do you see any generational changes occurring in views on tourism and sustainability?
Thank you, Lawrence, for this question. So I have not investigated generational differences personally, directly. I see these differences talked about a lot, and I am aware of some studies on it. So when I look at how people talk about differences, what I see a lot of my colleagues, with maybe in a moment of after work, with a glass of beer, talking about is that maybe, hopefully, the younger generation will kind of show a different behavior that the older generation did. And I hope so, of course, but from the theoretical perspective I most relate to, that is social psychology, so that's this idea of value, orientation, egoistic, altruistic, and biospheric, I actually don't think so, in the sense that we are in terms of values as guiding principle in life, we are all similar. We are all we have the all three, and I don't yet see that for in younger generations some of those values are more salient than in older generation. That is about kind of non-scholarly talk. The scholarly literature I'm aware of seems to point into the direction that young generation are highly alerted towards environmental problem. They are highly concerned, but are less able to act on them, maybe also because of a financial constraint, and that as those the baby boomers who or at least the section of the baby boomers who is more concerned about environmental and social problem, that is acting on them. I mean, of course, if you think about Fridays for the Futures, this seems to go totally against what I'm saying. So I guess that this conversation is not close with this answer that I'm giving to you at this moment in time. But thank you for raising the question of intergenerational research.
Hey, thank you so much for that. Yeah, the questions are coming in thick and fast now, and I think we might not necessarily get the time to answer all of them. But the next question that we have is actually coming from Michael, and he has two questions. I might only be able to answer one because I see all the other people are asking a number of questions. Thinking about time, at what point does a tourist cease to become a tourist and a member of a community? At what point does a tourist stop becoming a tourist and becomes a member of a community? When do we stop becoming tourists?
Oh, that's a beautiful research question. I don't know. Actually, I don't know. I guess that if I go back to Professor Trivas, he would say it takes years. What probably is then not possible for tourists. But I do hope that this is possible and this in a shorter time than an evolutionary view on altruism would allow us. But I don't know. So this is an exceptional research question. One of the things we may maybe dive into together in the future. I'm open for it. That would be my answer. Actually, don't know. It should be researched.
So there's another question from Desmond, which is really interesting, and I'm just hoping that I've captured the question. Looking at that COVID situation where some people decided to wear masks and some did not, and he's wondering if we need to consider the culture of human nature.
That's also a very good question. I mean, it has pointed to me that we should be, also a scholar, me personally as a scholar, but I think also maybe generally, that I might keep it at myself, that I should be much more aware of intracultural differences, also in looking at sustainability, for example. That is much more my area of research than reason why people will, put a mask on or not. And I'm aware, I'm generally aware of differences in considering sustainability from a global north perspective, global south perspective, but this is still too broad, it's too thick, it's not sophisticated enough. So yes, I guess we should really also look into cultural differences. So again, the theoretical perspective I'm coming from, this about value orientation, was based on the work by Professor Salomon Schwartz on universal human values. And I know there is criticism of that work, but the implication of that work seems to be that doesn't matter in which culture you find yourself, these values are part of your human texture, and the difference may be more of salience. So that for one culture, some values may be more salient than the other. And of course, difference can also be found in the way we go and satisfy those values. But it's, of course, a different discourse. So again, thank you for pointing to that aspect. I think it's important not only in the COVID context, but also in the context of trying to encourage a sustainable form of tourism.
Okay, thank you so much. So Chris is wanting to follow up on the issue of time, and he's asking if you have delved into the materiality of time in tourism encounters.
Chris, could you a little bit, maybe in another in another chat elaborate a little bit on that. As I was saying, I'm really starting this now, so I guess that my first answer would be no or not yet, and again that I would be more than happy to look into this with you. What I'm really curious about and keen to look into is, can we indeed design, the encounter between host and guest outside the physical encounter in a way that this taking and giving that reciprocal altruism needs is already started. That will be, I think, the first thing I'm going to, but more than happy to keep considering also this concept of materiality, probably you mean also impact with you.
Yeah, okay. So many, some of the questions you don't have enough space to explore the real questions, so they're quite brief. But we probably have time for just a couple more questions. And this one comes from Serkan, who is saying that the sustainability is obviously a frequent part of academic discourse. But what does that mean in terms of tourism stakeholders and their adoption of sustainable goals and implementing them?
That's an amazing question, and I guess the answer is not easy to be given because it depends a lot on where you're looking at. Maybe for me a little bit of a disambiguation. Really, for me, sustainability means not only the environmental component but also the social component. And to me, sustainability cannot be achieved without the involvement of stakeholders. We have to get out of this idea that. I guess that here I'm a little bit following also what has been the reflection of scholars such as Higgins Violas, for example, right, that is claiming the necessity that the community is going to be central to tourist development, so that we forget the idea that is a destination manager who develops a destination, but is calling on the community, a very different stakeholder, to start this form of development. So yeah, and if your question was about, is the concept of sustainability also lived up in communities, I would like to, by people in the community or businesses in the community, at least in several of the practical projects I've been involved with, to try to make things more sustainable, my answer will be yes. But I'm not sure if I got your question correctly. It's not so easy to communicate through a chat.
Yes, I know. I think we have the chat so we can get in as many questions as possible. So it's really difficult to have a full exploration of them. So I do have a time only for one more question, and this has to be a quick one. And I do apologize to others who have asked questions that we haven't been able to get through. But this one is from Anke, looking at the more social aspect of human nature. For example, the idea of tourists acting in a more social way. That means if everybody is doing it, why should I need to change my own behavior? So it's looking at human nature in a more social way than more perhaps in an individual way.
Yeah. So if I can again interpret this from the paradigm I'm coming from, that would be kind of, I see everybody, so this descriptive norms, everybody is behaving that way, why I should behave differently. Now the big question mark for me would be, isn't it so? Isn't it everybody behaving that way? And there was also, that way in the sense the cheating way, okay? There was also what come across my mind when I was listening to the webinar I was talking of reading some work. I don't think most students cheat. I think actually that is a minority. It's again, the same type of question of the emergency landing. We think that the majority may cheat because we come from the dismal view and we downplay the role of altruism. I don't think it's so. And I think that most tourists are decent people behaving decently. And under certain circumstances that can become different. But I'm afraid that there is not so much time to discuss this beautiful question, Anki. And I was asking, I'm not sure if the chat is going to be saved with the recording. If not, I would like to invite everybody. Oh, yes, it is. But otherwise, I will invite everybody who had a question in the chat and would like to start a conversation with me to reach out. I would love to continue this conversation and maybe, foster some partnership to delve more in depth in some of the questions that you have raised. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elena. I just want to say thank you to you for this really interesting and thought-provoking presentation. And there are just so many wonderful comments in the chat about what you've said today. And we really need to continue this conversation. Perhaps we'll meet in person to continue this conversation. Thank you so much, and thank you to the audience for listening. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you.